another amazing guest. And sorry, we're running just a tad late today. The electrons didn't want to cooperate. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring on one of my dear friends and mentors. I know I say that a lot, but I'm really blessed with all these great people in my life. And he's coming all the way from Canada. We used to do a show together where we would argue across the border. And I hope we'll do a little of that today. So, all the way from the great white north. And I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself because I can't fill his resume. And Jon Hansen, bonjour.
Hey Jim, great to be sharing these virtual errors with you. You brought back some great memories of the show, the 49th parallel. And I always say this, Alex was the voice of reason. And we did have some interesting dialogues. The most memorable for me, I don't want to go too much of a tangent, was when we had, what was it, Hardhead Larry or Billy or whatever?
Oh my
Remember
God.
him?
Yeah. Yeah. He
I
was
think somebody threatened to burn down your house. That was, remember that?
he was fantastic.
Something like that.
Yeah, that was after 9/11. We got into some political stuff. And always if you're coming in on the replay too, share your comments, share your ideas. If you're on the replay, we'll make sure that we get questions to Jon if you're directing them to him, and we'll answer them directly if we can. If you're live, come on into the conversation and we'll pop your comments up on the screen. That's from Facebook Live and YouTube. So, all right, Jon. So one of the reasons, one of the many things that you're an expert in, you spend so much time in procurement, and you're an international speaker in that topic, and people are very, very concerned about the supply chain right now. Can you give us your insights? What do you think's happening? What do should we worry? Should we take some precautions? What should we do?
Well, and this is the thing. Just to give a quick background, I've been in high tech for more than 35 years in procurement, not that much shorter of a time, and so I've seen the evolution of the practice and the technology behind it. So there's a depth of scope here. And one of the things, and I'll start off by citing statistics. The International Association of Commercial Contract Management, IACCM. I was on the call with him, the CEO, and one of his top executives, and they had done a survey of their 70,000 global members. And in March 6th, they asked, "What degree has COVID-19, the pandemic, disrupted your supply chain?" And at the time, about 27% of the organizations who responded said, yes, we are experiencing some form of disruption. A
Mm.
few weeks later, they did a follow-up survey, and that number grew to 60%. And then about mid-April, a third survey, again, a follow-up to the previous two, reported that 78% have been disrupted in some way or another. So when you hear that, all of a sudden you're wondering, are we going to have food shortages? Are we going to
Right.
have shortages on the shelves? Well, number one, don't go out and buy a lot of toilet paper. You don't have to. It's all there. And I say that tongue in cheek. But let me create a perspective for your listeners that provides a reality of just how supply chain permeates our everyday lives and the importance of working in some of the key areas. And then I'll touch some of the more challenging areas.
Mm.
I would hazard a guess, whether you agree with social distancing and self quarantine or not. One thing is certain: any efforts to implement that would not work if we did not have the ability to very easily and very simply access entertainment, access internet, order groceries online, order goods online. And
Mm.
so what that tells you is that because we are not in a predicament where we can't get what we need, whether it be food, whether it be medicines, whatever else, because we are not in that predicament, the social distancing measures have worked to the degree that they have. And again, you're not getting into the merits of it or not. Just to digress, I live in the province of Quebec, who's just made the announcement that they're sending the kids back to school on May 11th, starting at the elementary
Right.
level.
Right.
And they're responding to the majority. They're responding to the majority who are saying it's time to get back in. And, it's an interesting survey. And again, I don't want to get too far off. Interesting survey. But Quebecers have a life must go on attitude, and that this is just part of life and part of risk. And, we've hibernated enough. However, in the government's wisdom, which I appreciate and respect, those who are less inclined to venture out, who still want a social distance, aren't penalized if they don't send their kids to school,
Mm.
because they're making the online courses available. So I think there's an intuitive thing, and got there simply because what it shows is the elasticity and the responsiveness of supply chains. Not only that it affects all of our lives, but ultimately, it enables us to carry on a degree of normalcy, whether it's an old normalcy, a new normalcy, or a yet undefined normalcy. So when you hear the numbers of disruption, you then now say, okay, it's not affecting me on the frontline basis. Where does this disruption potentially occur? Now, I want to wade through the fear. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I wrote an article, a little bit longer, on the fact that the disruption of supply chains and the focus on treating COVID could interrupt the treatment of other ailments and illnesses. And there was very much a fear saying that if we can't get to doctors, if we can't get the medicines we need to treat heart conditions and diabetes and things like that, the mortality rate indirectly related to the COVID potential interruption of the supply chain would be key. Well, we haven't run out of any medicines at this particular point in time. And again, that's where I want to get the broader perspective of the fact is that these interruptions have had very little impact on the average citizen. And that's in a great testimony to the resiliency of supply chains. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't difficulties happening. We know, for example, that when it first started surfacing in China, that there were fears from everywhere from the NHL saying we're going to run out of hockey sticks to automobile manufacturing plants closing down. But again, I ask on a very practical level, for the average citizen, how many of you have gone without? So the breakdowns in chains have not reached to the point of a critical mass where anyone in the general populace is going out with whatever they need. So that's the perspective you have to look at. Now, the resiliency, in certain cases, they're being stretched. Now, many people talk about the PPE shortages. You know, the story came out of Canada that orders in China for the PPE products were being hijacked on the tarmac as countries are sending people with briefcases full of money, buying it and rerouting it indirectly from the rightful place to the other. We know what happened in the U.S. with regards to the measure of the Korean War Act, where what was it? The General Motors plant in Indiana was forced to convert its plant production to these masks, and without again getting into political elements. Is there a shortage or isn't there a shortage? Frontline workers will tell you that, and there is some exposure. On the other side, I walked into the local grocery store or the pharmacy, and I was able to get masks. Now, were they the N95? No. But the reality is that outside of those acute areas, like frontline medical staff, outside of those acute areas, you're not really going to see a shortage or an impact in any real life practical way. However, as this continues to develop, we're going to find out how truly resilient our supply chains are. And more so, I would suggest, after the crisis, because it's projected. A New York Times article talked about the fact that many, they call it zombie businesses or sunset industries, Jim, who were on the cusp of going under or can't take the financial strain. Many upstream suppliers will be gone. Different industries will be certainly changed dramatically. And that's where I think the real test is going to come for supply chain, is finding new sources of supply. Now, let's expand in the overall strategy, because one of the issues with supply when China went down, if you remember the SARS out, it had certainly a serious impact on China. But as the New York Times article reported, at that time, that many years ago, China was really producing sneakers and T-shirts. They weren't going to ruin the world if we get sneakers and T-shirts. But now China is, because there's been an aggressive low-cost country sourcing strategy, and we've put all of our sourcing eggs in one or two proverbial baskets, one of the main ones being China, for all ranges of goods. Yes, there are an element of risk in there, because we now have to look at it and say, for example, in France and even in Canada and different parts of the world, saying we have to repatriate or shore some of these supply chains to domestic capabilities. Easier said than done, because again, the whole reason low-cost country sourcing was ideal is that you get cheap labor and low costs. How do you repatriate that to Canada and the U.S. when the cost of these goods are much higher? So there's got to be a balancing act, and some are calling perhaps a hybrid. But I will say this, the greater challenge for supply chain, challenge in terms of businesses and the economic impact and the reverberations from this will occur after this immediate pandemic crisis has passed.
Well, of
So I don't
course,
know. Does that answer your question?
well, you opened a lot of cans of worms there, you know. And one of the things that's very critical, like you said, our dependency on China for production of some of these goods, particularly electronics. So it's very interesting that, you know, there's kind of an intersection of chaos here where we've increasingly become more dependent on electronics, especially for communication now. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of industries, you know, my industry, I mean, your industry, the speaking industry, came to a dead stop. And then all of a sudden, within a few days, a 180-degree pivot for those of us who could to go online and to open up virtual events and do things like this. That's just a small portion of what's out there. I mean, how many industries have over the past few years adopted much more sophisticated means of, like you said, nourishing that supply chain, getting goods and services to where they need to be on time, all serviced through electronics, right? All serviced through communication devices. And so for us to be that dependent on the Chinese for those, I know South Korea produces a lot as well. I'm also seeing that it seems that some of the other, I'd hate to say underdeveloped because a lot of it is our own fault that we've kept them out of the, you know, tried to stifle competition. But we're seeing it pop up in Africa, for example, now where they're starting to say, "Hey, let's get involved in this. Maybe we can produce it." And there you have lower costs of labor and whatnot. But there's still going to be some time to ramp up just the physical production, right? And like you said, repatriating several companies. Didn't Sony pull back from China themselves? Their Japanese manufacturing is coming back. I thought I heard a story about that
Well,
the other day. But it's going to take time for that to
Well, I
happen.
hadn't heard that specific story, but I think what's happening now with the fluidity of the situation is that there's a lot of speculation as
Mm,
to what will happen, how it will happen, the
right.
redirection of these new channels. And that's why I go back to saying it's a complicated issue
Mhm.
that will have to be addressed. You know, when you're in the middle of a crisis, what you do is you make work what you have. And there has been some surprises and there has been breakdowns. But in reality, it's going to be the new business landscape. And
Mm,
things are going to change within the procurement world, within the supply chain world. There's going to be a greater consideration in terms of the relationship between suppliers and buyers. It's going to move more and more, and it has been at times at a glacial pace, but more and more it's going to move towards a relational versus transactional type of interaction, being that a
mm,
transactional is how can I get it at the best cost,
right.
where a relational one is you take into consideration everything from end to end, including DSO. Day sales outstandings are very important to suppliers because that's how they paid. And in the past, payments and whether or not there was supplier liquidity was not as important as it should have been. The transparency throughout the chain was not necessarily the same. I think we're going to see gradual improvements in that area, and certainly plug those gaps. But it is not. I think the most challenging times in many ways will be beyond this crisis, and then when those new chains of supply get set up, what will the cost be? And ultimately, at the end of the day, and supply chain touches every part of our lives. You know, you
Mhm.
see somebody with a phone, that's gone through supply chain. You see
Right.
somebody with a bag of groceries, that's gone through. I mean, ironically, uh, when the crisis first emerged out of Wuhan, and they were talking about closing down plants, auto plants overseas, the biggest fear at those early days, and I'm talking about February, was stores running out of inventory, not because of what was happening because of a virus overseas, but because of the protests with regards to a pipeline running through Columbia and the protests disrupting rail transport and not being able to deliver things. So,
Mhm.
I mean, what we're seeing
Yeah.
here is obviously the latter is elevated in terms of impact than the former. But the reality is supply chains are, in generally speaking, uh, they have to have an amount of elasticity and a responsiveness that is best proactively structured than reactively structured.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that these are some of the important lessons that are coming in.
Well, you know, and I'm glad you touched on the fact that, you know, we need to shift. Well, we need to shift. We've been champions of it for years. That's what our business is built on, is that you know, relational types of transactions instead of, right. You know, that we deal with one another as human beings. And yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot more movement. I hope we're on our best behavior after too, because people in a lot of ways have been forced. It's ironic that we've been forced apart physically, right? And then trying to connect electronically. And I'm hearing story after story from leaders who are saying it's actually caused them or given them opportunity to reach out more directly to people. Now, it's still not the same as being in the room, but and I do believe you're absolutely right, especially when it comes to supply chain and direct sales, that people need to think of these relationships more. Well, I know the words keep circling, right? We have to look at doing business relationally instead of transactionally. The transaction's there. I mean, that's built into the process. You can't escape it. But the more that we can trust one another, and like you said, it's we can look at low cost. How can I get this quicker, cheaper, faster? Or can I depend on you? And can I depend on you to be responsive if there's a problem, right?
Well, and that's true, and that leads into, see, you've now have two paths of direction here, and I want to touch on both because I think it's important. Let's look at the remote working side and the
Mhm.
permanent impact that's going to happen. I'll touch on that momentarily.
Mm.
But I used to speak very often at conferences, and it was actually quoted in Forbes article about the emerging 3D supply chain. And I talked about the I-35 bridge collapse in Minnesota, and I'm sure we
Mhm.
all remember that tragedy. And one of the interesting things about that is that when that occurred, besides rebuilding the bridge because it was a major artery, obviously, between the twin cities, they also wanted to honor those who had lost their lives. And what the state did is they abandoned their normal purchasing or procurement protocol and went towards what's known as an open book framework, a relational framework. And then they shared the risk openly, and costs were open because they were doing something, employing an architectural technique that no one had done previously. So what they had to do is throw out the book on the way they did things to
Mm.
respond to the crisis. And the bridge was built in record time
Right.
on budget. The very next bridge project, when there wasn't a crisis behind,
Yeah.
ended up being late and over budget. So the question that you raised, Jim, which is very good, and I'll get on the remote working part in a moment, is that our memories tend to get short
Mhm.
once the immediate pain has passed.
Sadly.
So the
Yeah.
real sticking,
Mhm.
yeah, that's true. It's human nature.
Mm.
So the real stickings here is going to be, what lessons have we learned, and will it have a viable alternative or hybrid alternative to
Mhm.
a sole country sourcing strategy? What will that look like, and will we have the will and the desire to follow through
Yeah.
as the pain diminishes into being an old memory?
Mhm.
Now, one thing that I do think will stick, which is going to change the dynamics of the way we work, and this is key. Prior to COVID-19, HBR, Harvard Business Review, did a study and reported that 30% of all organizations had a remote working strategy.
Right.
That doesn't
Mhm.
mean that 30% of was all working home. They had a
No.
strategy and had some working from home.
Mhm.
Now we have all moved to the remote strategy. We're all working remotely with the social distance and the self quarantine. And so the question that I'm often asked is, to what age will this change? Like, in other words, once it passes, will people go back into the office? In the procurement world, and there are multiple surveys, obviously, and so you have to balance all of them, but one reported a 60% increase in productivity through remote working. Now, the reality of that is, and you know what, you and I don't want to give us away, but we talk about this often. We're old guys, we've been around. The face-to-face meetings and whatnot, and shaking hands and kissing babies and doing
Mhm.
all those things that you do through interaction. The reality is that when you work remotely, and there is a downside I'll get to momentarily, but when you work remotely, you don't get the rate of interruptions that you do when you're in the office. You don't have the stop and go. You don't have the distractions. And so people are able to work more efficiently, more effectively. Now, the downside, and I'm going to put aside for a moment the kids being home, because,
As
realistically speaking,
people
and
are
I've been
making that
working at home
transition.
since the
Yeah.
longest time. I've got a noisier staff now than I did before, with the interruption. I can't tell you how many times I've been on calls with top executives and knock on the door with the old "I'm hungry" or "I'm bored, what can I do?" But the reality is when life returns to normal, we now know that we can work efficiently. And
Mhm.
progressive companies, as you astutely pointed out, Jim, are the ones who are actually accelerating their engagement because of the remoteness. that's creating a whole new sense of connection. So I think that 30% will dramatically increase, especially given the nature of technology. The downside, and this is going to be the detractors, is when you work from home, you don't tend to have the framework of hours of I punch in here, I punch out here. You don't have the rigidity of time. And so one of the concerns is that people are working more hours than they would have had they been at the office, which may be great for the company's perspective, but you still have to now be self-managing in terms of balance. You have to be able to get up and stretch your leg, be able to walk away and have lunch away from the system. But in reality, the fact remains is even with those downsides, I think we're going to find a lot of people who are going to be looking and organizations saying we can work as effectively at home as we could in the office. We don't need all the office space. We don't need all the overhead and the cost. There's going to be a ramification from that. Because remember, there is a chain of both intended and unintended consequences to everything that happens. So what happens if the remote workforce becomes a reality 60%? What does that do in changing the dynamics? What impact will that have on highways where you won't have as much traveling, where the only traffic I have to navigate in the morning is to make sure I don't step on one of the kids' Legos going down the stairs? What will that do in terms of that? Car sales, automobiles. Those are things that we don't know yet and have calculated, but the remote working environment, I believe, is going to be the most pronounced beyond supply chain, but business in general, pronounced change that we're going to see as a result of this.
No, I agree with you all the way down the line there. And it's interesting because, and you touched on it, the idea is balance. There's going to be a balance. We probably weren't utilizing remote work to the degree that we could before. And I'm going to talk about balance both externally and internally because you touched on that as well. For the organization, yes, it does mean sometimes there's going to be there are going to be some efficiencies. One of the interesting pieces of research, though, yes, the productivity's gone up with remote work. But we're not far enough along. Early studies into this showed that there may be a decline, though, in innovation and creativity, only because there's a certain dynamic that happens when we're in the same space together that's very difficult to replicate online, even as sophisticated as we're getting with some of these platforms. We can come close, but it's not quite the same. So I think there is going to be a balance between, and a lot of organizations do this. Our friend Jeff Dalton, who's one of the champions in the agile world, they've been doing this for quite a long time in agile leadership, where most of the work is remote, but then they very deliberately make sure that they're in the same room once a quarter, twice a year, whatever that organization structure supports. Internally, you just hit the nail right on the head. And it's fascinating because you're right. Those of us who have been doing this for a long time, wasn't really much of a transition. You have kids, so that's a little bit different, but you have kids anyway. They're just not there all the time, right? And when people are starting to deal with this, the phenomena of working those long hours, right, which is not everybody's cut out for. I know you and I kind of enjoy that, but in and amongst that, spending the time, the flexibility of time, I really appreciate that, where maybe your day changes. Maybe you are getting up a little earlier and working, and a little later, you're going to work a little later, but somewhere in the middle, you're taking 2, 3, 4 hours to really spend quality time with the kids. So there may be a shift. There are some jobs that are sensitive, time sensitive, obviously, but there are many jobs that would allow that flexibility. And so those are my thoughts on it. And before, we're trying to stay lunch friendly. We could talk all day on all these things. I want to make sure we switch over a little bit too. Let's have some fun. Let's talk about some politics, political leadership. I know, like the United States, my heritage is French Canadian too. So I know, especially in Quebec, right? Very much independent minded people, as you've been talking about. United States and Canada, both founded by fiercely independent people who want to maintain that. And then all of a sudden, we're thrust into this world where the mayor of a town of 250 people is coming out with executive orders and edicts, right? And my thought on it, and I'm going to be quiet and listen to you, my thought on it is this. I've had very few issues with a lot of the, let's say, instructions, guidance that's come down from some, because I have enough faith in the system to say most people that are governing, not ruling, hopefully, are considering all the options. They're weighing the options. That's what we pay them for, and bringing us out the best information they can. So you take something like the distancing and the masks and whatnot, or arbitrarily which businesses are being allowed, I hate that word, allowed to open or not, based on what? Um, it should be based, or hopefully it's based more on their ability or their capacity to be able to respond and operate safely, not so much on the social distinction between, let's say, a massage parlor and a spa, right? Which maybe have the same functions, but have a different connotation in people's minds. So anyway, as we're trying to make this shift, and now it's reached critical mass. I mean, people are out there protesting, and I don't know. I haven't followed it deeply enough in Canada yet. I know there were some rumblings about prohibiting protests. That's happening here as well, and to me, that strikes at the very core of it. That's one of our fundamental rights, granted not by government, by nature, by our nature as human beings. I'm a John Locke fan, but with that going on and the pushback going on, do you think there's a balance here? What have our leaders done right? What have our leaders done wrong in response to all this? Is it too much? Are we starting to enter? Is Orwell's worst nightmare coming true?
Well, okay. Well, first of all, let's step back. I'll keep it more localized. Let's talk about the Quebec government. And the reason why I'm starting with them is that under the circumstance, and remember, Quebec is Canada's epicenter, much like New York is in the US. We have more cases, even though Ontario has a much bigger population. The rate of death has it. Won't get into the numbers and the discrepancies that come up with the false negatives and all these things. One of the things starting out with the government that I like is that, again, let's go back to this returning to school. The government listened to the public, and the public said 60% or so, 60% said we want to start living again, and want to open things up. Yet there is, almost half who are, we'd rather stay hunkered down until this thing passes. And there's even a petition going around Montreal where they've had 250,000 signatures saying we want to keep the schools closed. But government's attempt to do this was to be in sync and in tune with its population. And so what they said is, we are going to open the schools on May 11th, but it is optional for you if you want to send your children, your own good judgment. And I want to touch on that for a moment, of your own good judgment, is that if you don't feel comfortable sending your kid, you will make the resources available online as we have been, so they will not be penalized. Now think about that approach for a moment, because what it does is it removes the divisiveness of saying you either be here or you've got to be there. So take it as simple as me. I wear a mask when I go outside. I'm going to be 61 this year. I wear a mask simply because it makes me feel comfortable if I'm going into a grocery store. Outside of that, I pretty much stay in because I work from home to begin with, but I'll go out jogging and respect social distancing. But I do that not so much just for myself, but respecting the other person. Right. And I think what the Quebec government has done well is that they've looked at it as the whole and have been able to try to come up with a balanced approach. Not that they're trying to please everybody, but they're trying to leave the power of decision in the good hands of the people. And, and now some people say, well, masses don't or have the ability to make intelligent decisions. And we do see people doing dumb things all the time, but that's outside of a pandemic that happens. So what the Quebec government, I think, did well was that. Now let's go across Canada, different provinces. Ontario has a whole different approach. They're closed down to next year. There were police cars on the schools. There were police cars on the border. Remember, this is a border between provinces that you can cross without even thinking. And they had a border to see what's going in and what's going out. But again, there is an element of that where it wasn't an imposition as much as it's a direct or guidance. So I've never felt that I was being dictated or my rights were being violated. I think that's the key. So let's look at an perspective. And so the government of Canada and what's his name, Trevor, who does that show at night in the U.S. Yeah, he took over from. I
know what you're talking about. I don't watch it. Yeah.
He did a tongue-in-cheek thing about Canada. What are you trying to do? One up America? Because the Canadian government, and as much as they had difficulty within the first few weeks of the crisis hitting and people going home, being laid off, put a couple $1,000s in everyone's bank account. because what they thought from a national standpoint was that we'll leave each province to decide how they're going to approach this.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, at least in the short term, we have to at least send something out to people to help them get through this period. They issued orders that landlords couldn't throw tenants out if they couldn't pay the rent, for example. Hydro said they were not going to cut off anyone's power. So there was, I would say, in a very disorderly situation, there was an orderly approach to it. Is there agreement across the board? No. Is there moments of heated debate? Yes, of course. People are wondering. But what's interesting is those debates go to the of what exactly are we dealing with here. And I think the greatest level of frustration is the contradictions we're hearing from one day to the next of wear a mask, don't wear a mask, wear a mask. This many people are dying, mortality rate. Oh, wait, there's a negative of 30%, mean 30% of the people who supposedly took the test and don't have the virus actually did have the virus. We don't have numbers going out. And I think what I did from my personal standpoint is I stopped following the story after a couple of weeks intently. I'll check and see what's going on, but you move yourself back and get some perspective. So we don't know what we're dealing with at this point, but I think you have to ultimately, a government is there to serve its people, and you ultimately have give the people, to a certain degree, some good judgment latitude to be able to decide what's right and what isn't right. And if you are going to keep businesses closed, you've got to have a clear plan as to how you're going to get by that. And you also have to be able to recognize that you can't keep people closed and not have money coming in and not have the infrastructure to support such a decision. So that's from a Canadian perspective. I think that, there have been people who have been affected, but certainly I get a general feeling that there's a more of a cooperative attitude than a contentious one amongst the citizenry. That's just my take.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to wrap it up too. I was braced to go and offer some very pointed and clinical criticisms of some of our government officials here. But you know what? I think let's leave it with that for today. That's a nice place to leave it. And I appreciate what you're saying, that there's a vast difference. Our societies here in the West were founded on governments governing, not ruling, which was the great departure from the European model. Right? We're not subjects to rule. We created governments to serve ourselves. You just said that. I think it's a beautiful way to say it. So, yeah, let's. How cool is it to be able to say this? Let's look to Canada for their example. They're providing a great example of leadership. It's a pleasure to say that. Hey, listen, just before we wrap up, too.
Canada.
Go, Canada.
And by the way, just as a side note, we have we won the NBA championship last year. Just saying. Just saying.
Well,
I'm not saying anything more.
Did you have any Canadians on that team? I'm just asking. It's like us with hockey.
You know what,
right?
We did at one point. Yeah, we do. We do. We have Boucher and a couple of good Canadian kids there.
Good.
Yeah. But hey, listen. It's like NHL hockey. There used to be 90% Canadians. Now it's an international flavor. So I guess that's part of it all. But at least the team is Canadian.
Hey, before we say goodbye to John, we're still, if you're watching this before May 31st, 2020, we're still offering our black belt level membership in the Sensei Leader Movement. We'd love to have you involved. We're connecting leaders all over the world. We have members now as far away as Africa, as far south as South America, Argentina, a lot of people in the Caribbean islands, Canada, of course, UK, all over the world. And it's really, a remarkable network. All you need to do to get involved right now, the Black Belt membership is free. And the special thing about the Black Belt membership, you're going to get an ebook bundle and some online courses, self-study courses. But we have a live call every month, too, for the Black Belt members. It's usually $30 a month or so. And right now, just sign. It's a bit.ly link to go there, SLM Black Belt free, and sign up and take advantage of it. And yes, it does. People have been asking. It stays free as long as you stay active. We're not jacking the price up after the COVID crisis. Okay, so you join now, and it's free as long as you stay active. And John, I didn't see you on the membership rolls. We got to get you on there. We need you.
Now I saw the link.
There you go. Hey, Jon, thank you so much. Hang on with me after we finish up, just to say goodbye. Really appreciate you being on and sharing your wisdom and uh, and like I said, if you're watching on the replay, which you will be now as soon as we disconnect this, please share your comments. Still, we'll get them to Jon. You can just put at Jon Hansen if your comments directed to Jon. We'll make sure it gets to him. Okay, Jon, thanks so much. You're the best.
As always, it's great to share these virtual airwaves with you, Jim.
Well, you helped me get involved in it in the start, so it's really cool. There we go.
Right.